Hey there, this is Natalie, and as you may or may not have seen, the Anime Man, or Joey from the Trash Taste podcast as you might also know him, recently uploaded an interview with Redo of HEALER author Rui Tsukiyo. He's dressed in this weird fox suit for the whole thing, by the way, and that's just because his identity is a secret, which is the case for a lot of light novel authors. He's not trying to troll the audience or to come out as a furry here. I think this interview is extremely interesting, and I wanted to cover it too because it ties into a lot of the points I made in my video about Redo of HEALER and the place of edgy content in the anime and light novel markets. I'm not going to go back over the points in that video, I'll link to it in the description, but essentially it was about how a lot of the backlash around the series did tend towards people thinking the author and the people who liked the show must have had some unhealthy interests or negative attitudes towards women. And the point I was trying to make was that the market for dark stories, including those with extreme adult content, has always existed, and it isn't made up of weirdos and psychopaths. And also that this kind of content is popular with women, as evidenced by the huge popularity of the dark romance genre, which is heavy on similar themes to Redo of HEALER and is often just as explicit, and that's in romance novels in the West. As for the writers, genre fiction authors for the most part write their stories with a specific audience in mind, and this is often a commercial decision rather than being about wanting to write their own personal fantasies. Now, Rui Tsukiyo talks about a lot of stuff in this interview, and I'll be showing some of the most interesting parts and commenting on them, though since this whole interview was set up by Kadokawa, and we know they're kind of big on striking AniTubers, I won't be playing the audio. It's in Japanese with subtitles anyway. I do really recommend watching the whole thing on the TheAnimeMan's channel if you're interested either in the light novel world in general, or if you currently have strong opinions either way about Rui Tsukiyo because of the type of content in Redo of HEALER. So let's go through some of what he says. First, he talks about how he originally got into light novels when he was in middle school, through seeing the anime adaptation of Full Metal Panic, and then decided to try writing them. He started out just writing as a hobby, but when sites for people to put out web novels got popular, he started uploading his work. This led to him being contacted by a publisher. He tells Joey he's been a professional writer for 5 years, and in that time has written 11 or 12 series, his favourite being his first series, because when he didn't have to worry about making a living from his writing, he just wrote whatever he wanted. He says his best written series, however, is The World's Finest Assassin gets reincarnated in another world as an aristocrat. This is going to be airing as an anime in the summer 2021 season, so naturally Kadokawa, who set up this interview, will be wanting him and Joey to promote it in this video, though I think he does seem sincere when he talks about how writing it felt like he'd landed a critical hit. Now, there's no mention of Redo yet, but we can already get the impression that he loves light novels, and he loves that he gets to do this for a living, but that he's also someone who's put a lot of thought into what makes a given novel successful, and knows that most of the time, just writing whatever you like isn't going to pay off. Next, he talks about his enthusiasm when he found out that Redo of HEALER was getting an anime adaptation. It was the first of his works to get one. Here, it seems that he was humble and grateful that his work was being seen by a wide audience. All that looking up his own work on Twitter and being so excited that he missed a deadline honestly is just kind of cute, and pretty much in line with what we see from other light novel authors and mangaka on Twitter. His work contains all the dark and edgy stuff, but it doesn't seem like that's an aspect of his persona when he's interacting with his fans. Consider too how a lot of what he saw on Twitter won't have been positive, so the fact he was still so happy and grateful for the fans he had shows that he had a healthy attitude of knowing who he was writing to please and being glad they liked what he'd done, rather than getting defensive or lashing out at criticisms of what he chose to include. This can be seen as a professional way of handling it, and not really the way you'd expect someone who's written a story like that, due to having a misogynistic outlook or expressing their personal fantasies to react. In fact, when he does talk about the controversy later, he doesn't cast any aspersions on the people who hated his series, or seem upset by the way some people now view him. He just says this. This is smart reasoning for any creative endeavour really, but by focusing on the audience that could become big fans of his work and not worrying about those who are never going to like Redo of Healer anyway due to its content, he was setting himself up with the mindset of pleasing his target audience without compromising. It's likely the same approach that was taken when deciding to turn Redo into an anime, which is probably the answer to the question a lot of people were throwing around at the time of how did something this extreme get an anime adaptation? But with all of these niceties out of the way, Joey asks the big question, and Rui Tsukiyo gives the answer. He elaborates on this, saying that revenge stories were popular at the time, but most of the ones he read got the revenge part out of the way in just a couple of chapters, and then turned into normal harem stories. He basically saw something was popular, thought about what he did and didn't like about the existing stories for that market, and then set about designing a revenge story he thought would appeal even more to the existing audience, by dialing up the aspects they liked and extending the revenge theme for the whole plot. He says it was something of a gamble, because he was basically trying to serve what he thought might be a gap in the market, but it clearly was a gamble based on a theory that this kind of story could do well within a current trend. This is interesting because not a lot of authors talk openly about things like their market research or the more businessy reasons why they created things. This is because there can be this pressure to play along with the romantic idea that authors are always telling deeply personal stories that are important to them, and that they think of their characters as their precious babies. It's generally nicer for us as readers to believe that that's the case after all, rather than anything less artistic and more commercial. To quote Peep Show, "Here be beauty, there be pie charts." But for genre fiction authors putting out dozens of series in their careers, at least some of them are likely to be things they wrote to market, especially earlier in their careers when they're trying to win an audience, so that when they do write the more unique stories they're particularly passionate about, people will actually find them. That's not to say authors that do this don't put care into their books, or don't respect the target audiences they write for. It's more to say that there's a certain amount of professionalism involved, in much the same way as with a YouTuber trying to please the algorithm. It's very different from fanfiction written as a creative outlet. The author may be personally indifferent to any of the tropes, or in the case of not safe for work stuff, fetishes, that might appear in the novels. They engineer elements that will go into a book or series based on market expectations. We can see this throughout the interview, in things like how Rui Tsukiyo compares the things he wrote when he was doing it just for fun, with things like Redo of Healer that he wrote once he was seeing writing as his career. Still, Joey isn't letting Rui Tsukiyo off with just saying that he thought the revenge trope had some mileage left to explore, and he says that while revenge is a common theme in fiction, the revenge in Redo of Healer is especially intense, in terms of the violence and sexual content. Joey's being respectful and professional here, but you can tell what he's kind of hoping Rui Tsukiyo will take away from the question. Why did he put so much of that stuff in the story if it was just supposed to be a long-form revenge story? His answer to this again shows that Rui Tsukiyo had a very particular audience in mind. He wanted the scenes to be extreme, but without being overly gory. He understood there was a market for splatterpunk type stuff, but that the market for less gory but more sexual stuff was the larger one within light novels, and so he fit the level of violence to what he thought the audience would find cathartic, or would find uncomfortable enough to be interesting and dark, without going more for the gory style of violence suited to other audiences. Joey looked surprised and a bit skeptical at first at the idea that Rui Tsukiyo had had lines he wasn't up for crossing while he was writing Redo of Healer, and I'm sure a lot of people thought the same thing. But it does make sense that his concern was about not crossing over into gore and making the work a different genre. He'd decided he was willing to go extreme with the sexual content, but in doing that he also had to consider what audiences who like dark erotica wouldn't want to see. Joey seemed satisfied with his answer, but we all know it's really the sexual content that was controversial, and so he asked some more questions about that to try to see what Rui Tsukiyo's thoughts and justifications are for that stuff. Here, Rui Tsukiyo talks about the common misconception that erotic novels sell really well, because sex sells, and how it isn't strictly true, something he comes back to later when he talks about how he's had offers to write erotic novels. This is actually the case. Erotic fiction does sell, but it's a small market full of niches of varying sizes. Writers often start out with it because there are so many niches with audiences expecting new content all the time that it can be possible to enter one of them and make some money as an unknown, while you learn the ropes of the industry and polish your skills at writing genre fiction. Most people who start out in erotica in the West move on to the far more lucrative romance genre, but there are also plenty of people who pivot into other types of genre fiction like sci-fi and fantasy too. But the skills you learn while getting comfortable with writing sex well and getting to understand what your audience likes about different elements you might include in those scenes mean you're well placed to include adult scenes in whatever else you write, if it seems like it would mesh well, and have them not be totally cringe-inducing like the sex scenes in a Dan Brown book. While Redo of Healer does have about the same frequency of sexual content as an erotic novel, and the author does seem to have been mindful to keep that frequency up, which is why some episodes of the anime have sex scenes that don't really add anything to the plot or to the character dynamics, which is something you'd expect to see in something where the ero content was the point. It is more of a hybrid of a fantasy revenge story and erotica than just a lewd harem story with edge. His point here is, I think, that Redo of Healer didn't do well just because it had a lot of sex in it, but because he combined that stuff into a genre where he thought it would be well received. Sex sells, but it's not that basic. He says that sex and revenge mesh well together because each allows for ways to intensify or necessitate the other. But then he says that when revenge is taken in this way, it's fun to watch, and Joey remarks that that's probably just his taste. This is where Rui Tsukiyo talks about it being fine to have fans and haters, and that if 50% of the people who see it love it and want to spend money on it, and 50% hate it and tell him he should die, that's better than 100% thinking it's fine, but not really becoming fans who'll buy the books, the clip I showed earlier. Next, Joey asks him about his female audience, and how Tsukiyo had tweeted that he was surprised when streaming data revealed Redo of Healer's above average female viewership. What he says here about there being a large female audience for edgy sexual content is similar to what I said in my previous video, but then he goes on to say that women seem to dislike the harem romantic comedy genre because the girls all fawn over the protagonist. Now, this is a quick diversion, and just take it as a theory because I have no evidence either way, and I'm not sure how one would even find out the answer to this. But my own understanding of audiences in these kinds of genres leads me to think there's a different reason not many women like those stories. We're talking here about the romantic comedy style of harem, where the protagonist will choose one girl in the end, and all the girls are vying for his affection, rather than the style of harem you see frequently in isekai, and even in Redo of Healer, where there isn't a lot of drama around the protagonist choosing one girl or the girls being in competition, and the girls form a kind of team together with the protagonist while all being romantically involved with him. The rom-com style harem works because people tend to root for one end ship, or just enjoy the situational comedy and shenanigans that can come out of several very different types of character all being in love with the same person. But the competitive aspect can become kind of unappealing if the viewer or reader particularly empathizes with one of the characters in the harem rather than the protagonist, because that character might lose and get their heart broken, or even if they win, there was always a time when their love interest was also flirting with all these other people. There are also people who just don't like seeing women have to compete for a man, though bear in mind that this genre does exist in reverse too in the form of otome series, so it's not some kind of misogynistic thing that only happens to women in anime, it's just a trope that some people don't find entertaining to watch. Personally, I like both harem and reverse harem romantic comedies, but that may be because I really watch them for the comedy more than the ships. I tend to get more invested in the romance plots of rom-coms that just have a main couple, like in Kaguya-sama or Nagatoro-san, but that's just me. Still, I digress. Rui Tsukiyo didn't really look into which types of stories sold well with female audiences until after he wrote Redo of HEALER, so it seems like he actually didn't realise this audience for his own books existed when he was engineering what he'd put in them, which is kind of funny. Now they wrap up the interview with Tsukiyo talking about some of the things that will be in Season 2 of Redo of HEALER if it ever gets a second season, including the battle with the Demon Lord, along with new characters in the form of a fox girl and a rabbit girl. He also promotes his new anime series airing this summer season, which I don't know much about yet, so it will be interesting to see if it's in a similar vein to Redo of HEALER or if it's a more conventional type of thing with less of the extreme stuff. The title, The World's Finest Assassin Gets Reincarnated in Another World as an Aristocrat, makes it sound like a fairly typical reincarnation isekai, but with an interesting gimmick around the main character having been an assassin. But I'll need to look into it more to know anything more than the light novel title's synopsis. So, what do you guys think about this interview? I think it was an interesting conversation. They were both in kind of formal, slightly corporate mode, rather than a more casual interview, which is to be expected given it was set up by Kadokawa and is the only YouTube interview the author has ever given. But I think Joey did get to ask the questions people are most curious about, and Rui Tsukiyo's answers were, to me at least, honest and interesting, rather than giving the feeling he was saying bland rehearsed lines he'd been told to say by his publishers. Let me know if this interview changed your perception of Tsukiyo as an author, or of the whole Redo of HEALER controversy, down in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again very soon.